All right, I believe we're live. So, by way of intro, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It's Michael Thaney with Startup Grind. We're joined here with David Brown from Impellent Ventures. By way of just quick updates or announcements, before I forget what to tell everyone, we are hosting a food and beverage themed pitch battle in April. So, if you are a founder of a food and beverage company, food and beverage tech company, and or have a friend or know somebody who would be interested in that, please apply. And then we just got word today, Maureen Bellatori and Metro Collective, who co-sponsors these events with us and is a great partner. So check out Metro Collective. She also just confirmed that we'll have Jen Smith from Grow New York in our May Fireside Chat. So check out the website or follow up on the emails if you want to see that. Sorry about that, Dave. I just knew I would forget that at the end as we got into a conversation here.
Well, no, hey, look, it's a perfect segue, right? You said food and bev, so make sure we bring out our own Patty's Day celebration. So
happy St. Patty's Day, everyone! If you're home joining us, feel free to take a moment and celebrate.
Happy St. Patty's Day, everybody!
Yeah, and for those who joined, maybe we'll be doing this in the middle of the parade next year. Yeah. So again, thanks again for joining us, Dave. And people will be trickling in a little bit as this gets started. But if you wanted to kick off and just kind of tell us, who David Brown is and what Impellent Ventures is.
Yeah, no, absolutely happy to do that. And, look, I was saying before we got this going, I was lucky enough to get to host a startup grind with one of, our mentors and the VC that I really appreciated, Eric Paley, back in 2016. And I just love the format of this in the conversation. But what's always the most interesting is making sure that we have whatever comments and questions that the crowd here has. So I'll try to keep my remarks somewhat short, so you don't, nobody starts yawning on St. Patty's Day about the history of why I am who I am and how I got here. But the very kind of quick high level. Grew up here in Rochester, left in 03 to go to college. Swore I'd never come back here because we're talking about Xerox, Kodak, Bosch and Long's end of kind of their era, and so. For me, I think roughly 20% of my class had left, or their families were in the process of leaving by the time we left. And so, as someone who was interested in innovation, never kind of viewed this as an area that I was going to be able to come back to. But lo and behold, years passed, and after being away from the area for 15 years, my mom ended up developing a neuromuscular. We decided to pack up the newly born kids at that area at that time, so 2017. And bring them close to grandma and grandpa with the idea that we'd move back here, figure out what's going on, and then figure out how to bridge back and forth to, the ecosystems and the spaces we'd already spent a lot of time in. The genesis or the question about what is Impellent, we're a fund that started because as I started bouncing around Rochester and talking to people and started bouncing around Buffalo and talking to people, started bouncing around Ithaca and Syracuse, and just seeing what was happening from an entrepreneurial perspective, so many cool things had started cropping up right when we got back that for me, having just returned from Boston, mirrored and echoed so much of the ecosystem development that we had just spent, a decade working on to really grow and build something exciting in that side of the space. And most people always think Boston's always had a tech presence, but if you look at it, 80s, 90s, really good in Boston, 90s through, late 2010s, pretty bad in Boston because we lost everything to the semiconductor race. And biotech was booming. That's where the governor was spending his money. But the tech ecosystem was very spread out, not centralized, not very conversive. And what had happened kind of from 2010 to 2022 today was a lot more of that reconsolidation of the core nucleus in the downtown ecosystem, a lot more support of the universities and tech hubs, and a lot more interest on how do you have entrepreneurship be a career pathway that's interesting. And the great knock-on effect of that was that the ecosystem picked up, entrepreneurship picked up, funding picked up significantly, and opportunity growth picked up significantly, which was awesome. And so when I came back to Rochester, I saw all those pieces, right? You start talking to the universities, the IP portfolios are fantastic. The student population's fantastic. You start looking at the schools, the companies that are in town that are just starting to pick up steam. They're getting funding, but more importantly, they're educating real skills and development. And so for me, having just moved back, I got instantaneously pumped up about this, right? And so the two pieces that we missed and what we eventually started Impellent on was looking at that ecosystem growth and saying, geez, huge opportunity if we can give more funding to these companies early on, and if we can provide more mentorship from other parts of the country, people who've been there and done that before, we can really accelerate and create a lot of value in this ecosystem. And so Impellent was founded end of 2019, officially launched in February 2020, right in time for COVID. And our investment thesis sits around pre-seed and seed stage technology companies that have capacity to grow really big, and we combine the best of what's happening in our region with the best of what's happening in larger tech ecosystems. And so that can mean two things: take a company from Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, give them funding, support, and networks, particularly networks from outside the area, so that they can grow. And when they're ready for that Series A, B, C, help connect them to the Andreessen Horowitz's, Sequoias, and downstream capital partners that we've spent years cultivating relationships and partnerships with. And then secondarily, taking investments in Boston and New York, and where appropriate, helping them connect in and plug into our local tech ecosystems, because at the end of the day, we need to make sure we continue to foster that next generation of entrepreneurs. And if you look, we did this interesting report when I did my MBA at BAPS, and if you look at when entrepreneurs tend to be most successful in actually launching and running their business, and this is not a hard fast rule, but it's a surprisingly interesting one, it's 5 years post their terminal degree. And so whether that's high school, college, MBA or PhD, once you're 5 years in industry, post that's when most people actually have identified an interesting pain point within a business segment and start to launch off their next generation of businesses. And so for us, bringing more opportunities for career paths for students directly out of the ecosystem was just as important as starting businesses here today. And so we continue to do the tug and pull for entrepreneurs and companies between the two markets, which has been fantastic and really exciting.
That's awesome. Yeah, we got a question coming in, which may be something that's close to heart here. But Maureen asked, what are some key things you're looking for in an investable startup? And before you answer that, encourage everyone to start throwing your questions here. We're going to try to keep this very fluid. So keep bringing in your comments and your questions.
Yeah, of course, Maureen. Fantastic question. So there's a lot of nuance to this, and we can continue to unpack it. But fundamentally, I think one of the pieces to understand about VC, right, is there's a whole lot of different stages within our investment world that are important, right? There's the early stage, the kind of middle growth, and then the late stage. And we are exclusively an early growth proposition. And for us, that means one thing more than anything else, and that's the team is going to be foundational. And the reason I say that is because without fail, we believe and we have recognized that every business we've ever invested in has been wrong about their thesis, right? So they're just starting something interesting. They've got some good market insights, but the more that they start to uncover, the more they start to recognize different pieces of the business that can be augmentable, the ways to grow, and the ways to add value. And so we spend a lot of time really honing on and who is the leadership of the team, why are they doing what they're doing, and how can we be supportive or creative to the growth cycle of that company. And so from a team perspective, I would say there's a few things that are fundamental. One, are you coachable, right? So, if we give you feedback, do you go out and listen? Two, do you understand kind of the primary triggers? I would say there are two types of entrepreneurs, right? There are the ones that have their vision and they're kind of stuck to their vision and they think they can kind of drive that through the market. And then there's the second side, which are entrepreneurs who understand that they're building a business in service of a customer. And when they're building a business in service of the customer, they're recognizing that every single trigger, every piece of response that they get helps prove or disprove different parts of the thesis. And so we look for entrepreneurs who come in and say, hey, we've got these 20 different pain points that we think are relevant to our customer buying behavior. And every time we go out and meet with a customer, we're trying to figure out, is this true or not true? If this happens, it leads us to this. If this is false, it leads us down this direction. And we can continue to pile on and add value from being able to prove and disprove that. And that's how we're really going to understand what's a scalable proposition within the customer lifecycle. And then the last piece, right, is once we found that we like that executive and the executive's doing something, we've got to actually make sure they're a leader, right? And there's a lot of pieces in what is a leader, but I always say the fundamental piece is being able to build a team, right? And so we're looking for people who not only are able to understand the market themselves, but are able to attract really good people to themselves. And that can be co-founders, it can be employees, it can be investors, mentors, advisors. But we look for people to be able to recognize where their weaknesses are and then augment it. So once we hit the team component, only then and only then do we start to say, is this sector attractive? Basic sector profile, right? We want to have at least a $2 billion addressable market. And that would be what we call like a semi-niche market, but we want to make sure that if you're in a smaller one, you either have pathways to a bigger ecosystem, or you've got cash on hand to be able to continue to grow, or you've got ability, or the market is growing at a compound rate that's interesting enough that over time, even if you only win 20, 30% of that market, you can become a $1 billion business yourself. And then lastly, after we've said, okay, team is good, market sector, is interesting, we say, can we help? And so can we help might say, this industry is something we don't know about. Do we have someone in our portfolio or who's an entrepreneur in our stable that we can help provide assistance to? Is it a business model that we recognize that can be helpful with? And do we know who the right downstream investors will be for you? And so if we can hit those 3 check marks, we're typically going to take a risk on a company. And obviously, as I said, there's a lot of additional things that can start to, gradiate or improve or change that conversation. But those are by far and away at the early stages, the 3 most essential pieces for us that we're looking for. And I would say number 4, right? Just for if you're looking for investment formulas, we want to make sure that if you're not at revenues, you've got a pathway to revenues within 12 months. So we don't like to invest in what we would call science projects at this point.
Awesome. That's real helpful. We got some related questions, but I'll kind of try to honor the ones that have been being submitted by folks. So
I know I put that up and it was distracting. I saw so many good questions kind of coming through.
Yeah. So Doug asks, what are some of the challenges you see in being a VC in Upstate versus the coast, like San Francisco or Boston?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Doug. I don't think there's a huge differential. And the reason I say that is because we don't invest just in Western New York. And so we've got access to those markets and those networks and partnerships. And so we've actually got a very robust pipeline. We've got a very robust co-investor list. We've got, good access and growth capital. What I would say is trickier running a venture fund in Western New York is, God, we would love to have our entire fund based on investors from Western New York. But if you look at the history of entrepreneurship, since kind of the Kodak, Xerox, Bausch & Lomb days, we haven't had a ton of successes. And so a lot of angel investors and LPs who would traditionally be the investors you look for don't have great experiences. So we have to do a lot of coaching, education, training to help support the underlying investor network, where if I lived in Boston or New York City full time, that's kind of an assumed value that most people have, or at least they're generally aware. I would say that's changing quickly, right? So we're starting to build a lot more understanding, awareness, and optimism about the upside. And you got to say, like, if you look what happened with Datto, if you look what happened with ACV Auctions, what's happening with Kasana now, some of these bigger brands, TCB, Chick, Player out of Syracuse, they're really starting to prove that venture can be a really exciting space and startups can be a really exciting space. And that's doing a lot of the education work for us here now. The other piece I would say, and again, this is improving, and so it's why we're optimistic. Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, they were all spread cities, right? Our downtown cores were not organic. The idea of having what we call natural collisions, where you go in, you start working on your business, and then halfway through the day, you're running into 10, 15 other people who can be helpful and help build connections to that next round, never existed, right? When everyone's sitting out in Victor operating a business, or, sitting down in, remote sectors within their own warehouse, that cross collaboration conversation doesn't flow as naturally. And so I've been really heartened to see the revival of the downtown cities and cores, and a lot more programming and support systems like Startup Grind coming in and saying, hey, let's have these organic conversations and discussions. And so, I would say really the two things that I would have told you when I moved back, I would have been most concerned about being an investor in the region, have started to dissipate, right? Then we're not perfect by any stretch. We've got plenty of ways to go, but I think we're starting to see some really exciting turn points for anything that would historically say this is bad. Now, I would say the third part before I forget it, because the other point I would have said early on that would have been problematic is if you were in Boston in 2015 or New York City or San Francisco, every single downstream VC would have told you there's no way in hell we're not investing in a company that's not within an hour drive of our offices. We need to be able to go see them, have a conversation, and do regular board meetings. And we can't drop in and see whether or not their salesperson is doing what they are supposed to do today. We just don't have that conversation. And so in 2017, I felt like we were starting to buck that trend. Because of COVID, that entire concern is gone. And every single one of our co-investors now are very happy to entertain conversations with businesses out of Western New York, which is a massive, massive opportunity for our region and for entrepreneurship in general.
Have you seen any like migration between like founders? Like, we share similar backgrounds in the sense that, I moved away and came back and had the opportunity to, you moved away. We actually probably crossed paths at a pub in Chicago at some point, not knowing each other. But you were in Chicago, you were in Boston for a while too, most recently. So are you seeing any sort of, kind of migration pattern between, your portfolio or just, deal flow that you're getting, like people coming in? Like, do you see people either coming back or like, again, these centers like popping up?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I think the idea of the boomerang to cities has always been a real thing, but you saw it way more with doctors, lawyers, and consultants previously. We're seeing a lot of folks, who are looking back and saying, geez, Rochester was a great place, or Buffalo was a great place to grow up. I'm going to go back there and have some of that presence. And so even if I'm looking at some of our attendees here, I know we got people from San Francisco, we've got people from New York City, we've got people from Chicago, from Rochester. So I think this group by nature is living proof that is absolutely true. I mean, during COVID, I took 15 calls from, highly talented product managers, engineers, investors, and similar, who were saying, geez, COVID's shown me that there's real opportunity to do something different. I'm home, busy mom and dad. How do I find a job in Rochester? How do I find a job in Ithaca? And, it was really cool to be able to plug them into some of those opportunities. I'm glad that some of them are actually here and making impact. But, it's really interesting because I think this is something we'll have to live with, is that we're going to have people coming back and we're going to see people who are going to continue to see opportunity here. And we're going to have a different part of that generational cycle that wants to be cities. So if you look at what's happening in New York and Boston, Chicago, they all went down during COVID, and Chicago's having a little bit slower rebound, but Boston and New York are at their highest, regrowth rates. Florida has been growing out of control, right? Like there's so much just general mobility. 10% of people said that they plan or would like to move within the next year in America. That's a really interesting statistic, and it gives us an opportunity to raise our hand and attract back a lot of people and to attract a lot of new talent. But it also means that a lot of these other areas are also fighting for that and creating an interesting opportunity. So I just see a much more mobile workforce at this point. People who are calling multiple places home, and Western New York hopefully is part of that story in some capacity.
Yeah, no, I agree. It'll be interesting too, as large corporations, as they handle coming out of COVID, I think there'll be an opportunity to kind of capture a lot of talent too. Speaking for kind of like, the tech space. Another question here we got. Current thoughts on climate tech or hard tech markets?
Yeah, I mean, huge, right? Like, I do have a lot of opinions. Some of them are dated. Some of them are relevant. So hardware technology, incredibly valuable, very interesting. We've got a few plays that are in consumer CPG. I always like to say, for us, bread and butter is B2B SaaS, right? Because your customer base, the sales cycle. And you have software, right? And your margins on software get really, really attractive quickly. Hardware, you start to layer in manufacturing costs, inventory management costs, and oftentimes international development costs. And so each of those things become risks. And so for us, right, when we're looking at hardware, and that obviously filters into climate tech and a lot of traditional clean technology applications, you have a lot more risk factors than other business models. And it also typically comes with a longer time horizon before exit because you've got to go through a whole extra manufacturing step. And so what I like to say is if you're going to go into that market, you need to be that much better of an entrepreneur, have that much better of a product, and that much better of a defensibility around what you're doing. With all that said, we believe full-heartedly that some of the best innovations over the next 20 years are going to be things that are real hardware and real manufacturing, and that are going to be within the climate tech space. The other side that I would say on climate tech, and it's starting to break, right, is there's a lot of excitement around what's going to happen with the next generation of clean and green energy. When I was at business school, we wrote a report on the last wave of green energy innovation in the late 90s and early 2000s, and it was the single worst venture capital returns by sector in the history of VC returns. And a lot of those reasons come down to the factors that we just talked about: incredibly expensive production. And if you think about it, right, like solar production, wind farms, like the early stage stuff was not light tech by any stretch of the imagination. And so I think what's interesting and motivating about this round of innovation is it's starting to look a lot lighter, a lot more succinct, a lot more predictable business and revenue models. And the other piece is when we first did that big cycle within the clean tech space, pretty much everything was backed by government guarantees. And so it was a really, unusual venture capital model. And so I think this one, well, backed by incentives, is not necessarily as geared back. And so a lot of the core foundation of the VC investment principles are a lot more interesting this time around. So all that to be said, I have a lot of hope and optimism within it. It's a sector that we're looking at. I can't say that we've made big investments within the space yet, but I'm really excited about what clean tech offers, and certainly hardware is something that we track on a daily basis. And I think a strength of the Western New York region.
Awesome. Yeah, because there's NextCorp has the climate tech program, or has a program for that. So I think
they got climate tech, they've got hardware development, Tech Garden's putting a new hardware component. Cornell's got a hardware, incubator. Rev Up is their, completely based around it. It's unbelievable. We've got great resources and technology in this space. We got manufacturing facilities, for $5 a square foot, right? Like, I mean, this is one of the better areas from a cost perspective to do some of that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's cool. And we're a region that's got, especially like agriculture, right? We had a good background.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So it was an interesting one from, I think, Attila, if I'm pronouncing your name right. But we had a question on what are some major flaws you see during most pitches? So maybe some advice for founders pitching.
Yeah, no. I mean, so I'll go back to kind of the early, there's a whole bunch of things, right, that come into it. But I would say the number one and number two thing tend to be what we talked about earlier, right? Like a good CEO is one who knows the assumptions and the model in which their business is built on. And so VCs are notoriously bad at listening for the entirety of a pitch presentation. So if you're coming in, don't expect to sit there with a deck and crank through, because what we like to do is actually throw you off your guard a little bit. So as you're starting to present one slide, we want to ask, okay, well, what does this do to this? And what that really is doing for us, and it's a little bit of a didactic process of understanding the business, but what it really does for us is it allows us to say, okay, if I throw this wrench in, do you actually understand what the impact on your business is? And do you understand kind of the core fundamentals of what your model and assumption risks are showing? And a lot of times founders don't get that, right? They're not coming in with a true understanding of what different triggers mean. Or if they do, understand the question, but they don't have an answer, they try to make up an answer, which is significantly worse than saying, this is actually a really interesting problem that we're now working with our customers to try to understand better and inform us, right? Number two is not being able to build a team. So if you haven't, if you come in and you don't have an idea of where your strengths and weaknesses are and how you're going to augment them, that's a really negative sign for us, right? And it comes through very quickly. Number three is not being a good listener, right? So if we ask a question, you're missing the point, or if we're asking for a certain piece of feedback and you don't provide it, that's often very negative. Number four is not following up. It would blow your mind how many people will go and have a conversation, not write back and kind of give validation or follow up on pieces of information they promised they would, or two, continue to provide kind of an ongoing data feed. One of the pieces that I think a lot of folks misunderstand about investors in general, we want more than anything to invest in every company that's here. Oftentimes we don't feel like we have enough information or enough time to process what's coming through. And so we leave it oftentimes on you, or it's beholden on you to continue to make your case. And so the number of times we've said no to a company and then changed our mind 6 months or 12 months later because of, more insights that they got from the market or, better progress that they were making is astronomical. I would say probably 50% of our portfolio are companies that we said no to, and then we were proven to be wrong, and we were happy to jump in. So make sure you take the time to follow up and really track down those pieces and continue to execute. Outside of that, take the time to get to know the investor, get time to have a real conversation. One of the pieces that is always interesting to me, right, is whenever I start a conversation with a new entrepreneur, I want to know why you're doing what you want to do. And there's two reasons why I want to do that, right? One is I want to make sure you actually have a real passion for why you're going to do this, because it's a long haul. Most businesses are not going to be a 3 to 4 year flip. In fact, the average venture relationship in America is now 7 years, which is longer than the average American wedding, which is a very sad statistic to say, but so for us, right, it's a marriage when we're going in. And so we want to understand your motivation, but then we want to make sure that we see the world in kind of the same way, because we want to be able to spend time with you, have real conversations with you, and be able to have a dialogue that's not defensive or aggressive. And that's an opportunity for us to learn together, because you're going to be right sometimes, we're going to be right sometimes, but we have to be able to kind of make that dance work together. And so I would say that is one of the biggest pieces is in that initial call. Don't just jump right into product. Actually take time to get to know the investor, make sure they understand who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. And that often gets missed.
Do you have any tips on doing that, or stories on like how that might happen? It's like, it sounds like that's not something that you can actually fit into a 7-minute pitch. Like, as far as building that relationship, are there any tips and tricks or failures for how that has worked or not worked so well in the past?
Yeah, no, look, when you're doing a first pitch, right, it's a cold room and you're kind of doing that, try to show a little bit of your relatability, right? Even in a 30-minute elevator or 30-second elevator pitch, right, you should have a few things that indicate why you're doing this and what you're learning and how you're hitting it. But all your pitches is a conversation starter, right, to get you into a more intimate dialogue. And so if you're going to have a real pitch with a VC, if they're taking it serious, it won't be less than 30 minutes. And most of the time it'll be closer to an hour, because we actually want to hear the story and the conversation. So within that dialogue, ask some questions, be inquisitive about who you're meeting. It's the same as any good job interview, right? I always thought it was silly when you're graduating college and people go, oh, what's the best thing someone, a prospective employee can do? And ask us good questions about the business, right? We expect you kind of do the same thing. Do you have a little diligence you've done on who this venture firm is, what they're doing? If you go talk to John Gavigan and the Endeavor Network, right? I know John's on the call here, or if you come talk to us, we have different theses, we got different histories, and it's important to take the time, even if it's 5 minutes, to go understand a little bit about who we are and find points of relatability, right? You can, in the middle of the call, there are all sorts of things behind me that you can relate to, have conversations about. LinkedIn has a ton of history about who I am, why I got to be where I am, different pieces that I've touched. And so there's a lot of points that you can start to trigger conversations and understand that interplay, and anywhere, right? So it's being observant. And to us, that's a true quality of a good entrepreneur, is being able to identify and cross up some of those network pieces.
Cool. We got a question here from Steve Nikosha about how many companies have you invested in New York State, and how long do you expect to see an exit?
How long till we expect to see an exit? Good question, Steve. So we have done 25 investments out of Fund 1 and Fund 2 so far. So 19 in Fund 1, 6 so far out of our Fund 2. We've got a lot of capital still to deploy out of Fund 2. So anyone with good businesses, we anticipate doing 30 to 35 companies out of that fund. So long way to go there. But the answer is for Western New York, that's about 35% of our portfolio at this point. And so we would love to, at some point, to get that to be about a 50-50 parity. And it's just about making sure we find the right deals and the right opportunities to be able to layer in. But we've been very happy with the quality of investments and companies that we've had. In terms of what is an appropriate exit period, Steve, that's a tricky one, right? Like if you look at the history of even the deals we've got within 2 years since starting our fund, we had one go out of business, we had one sell, right? And so those are the really quick turns. We've got some that if they sell before the 10-year period of our hold is done, I'm going to be very excited. And then there are some of the companies that I think might IPO in 2 to 3 years, having started with 0 2 years ago, right? So talking about a 4 to 5 year window. As I told you, our average hold period in VC is about 7 years. And so we always say that's our soft benchmark. But I would say the deviation on that says 5 to 10 years is the normative behavior for companies that we're investing in at kind of the seed level. But to hit it correct, right? Like when we invest, you might already be 4 years into your business, right? So that might be an 11-year journey for us to have a 7-year exit. Similarly, we might invest in some of the best companies, just take time to really work through and get to where you need to go. And while our time frame from a fund perspective says 10 years, we will extend and figure out ways to continue to work with those companies till we get to the right exit. You take Palantir as an example, right? Everyone's like, oh, Palantir, overnight success. They were 17 years in the making before they IPO, right? Like it takes that long to establish the right government contracts and relationships. And so we don't expect everything needs to flip quickly. And we as investors have a lot of opportunities to figure out other ways to make our own exit. But what we care about is when we invest in a company, we don't expect you to be in there forever, but we expect you to be building some really interesting things that lead you to a natural acquisition and time process. I also say, Steve, within that, we're in a weird time right now, right? Like first COVID, now we have war and that's having ripples on the economy. What happens in the world has real impact in terms of our capacity to get companies to exit, right? And so depending on what happens here in the next little bit, the IPO window very well might, dry up for another 5 to 6 years. And that's going to change the nature of exits. There's a lot of cash on hand for a lot of companies, but that might take a while to actually permeate and start buying brands again. And so there might be more periods within the near term where we have to carry deals for a little bit longer while we wait for certain parts of the acquisition and liquidity markets to come back online.
So I'm going to jump to a question that's not chronological here, but Emil asked about, in the spirit of that, this talk, if you could go a little bit more of like the formation, like of a VC fund, like kind of like what it takes, like the requirements, legal, marketing, a little bit of mechanics. So personally, right, when you said, you have the 10-year hold, like when you don't kind of get that exit in that time period, like what's that actually mean to you? Because like, as somebody who would have, if you invested in a company, your money's gone, right? But like you're still working, right? And like, it's not like you just sit there. So like in the spirit of kind of showing some of the, like just how does a VC work? If you could start with the kind of like that 10-year example, like what that actually means for like your financials, but then if you could kind of extrapolate a little bit of like what's that mean for like the business model of a VC?
Yeah, no. So great questions. A lot of things to unpack there. So I'll try to start with the simplest, most direct component that kind of helps people understand the world of VC, right? So our goal as a VC, if you want to be at least a VC that's in business for any period of time, is we're an asset manager, right? Our goal is to take funds that we get from outside investors and ourselves, deployed into interesting businesses that over time will appreciate in value. And then we can try to, provide some prescribed amount of return to investors. And so the standard of what has been considered a good VC is that over a 10-year period, you're going to return 3x capital after all fees and operating. And that means that the mix of the companies that we choose within our portfolio need to help us collectively return 3x. There's a lot of different models that help VCs do that. There's the idea that every single company needs to return between 2 and 5x, and then you can squeeze out a 3x doing it. And then there's the extremes where you say, okay, we're going to invest in 20 companies and we just need one company 60x, and then we got 3x for the rest of our portfolio, and then everyone else can die. And so, depending on how you look at the world, and what you think are going to be, game-changing businesses, and how you have a temperament as a VC to invest dictates what sort of revenue outcomes and exit outcomes you start to look for. We are not either of those, right? But we like to kind of exist somewhere in the middle. We like to have at least one company that typically returns the entirety of the fund, and then the majority of our companies performing well and returning, right? So for us to get a 3x, we typically want one full return of fund, maybe 2 full returns of fund, a number of companies in kind of a 5 to 20x ratio, and then the majority of our companies returning 1 to 5x over time, so that we kind of sustain the bottom piece, with the knowledge that, of the balance of our companies, maybe, 10 to 20% are going to go out of business, and we're okay with that risk, particularly if we manage and operate against our risk effectively. So what that means is that for us, we need to return that 3x within 10 years. And so for a company that goes longer, that one changes the ROI of a deal, because a 10x return in a 3-year period is very, very different than a 10x return in a 20-year period, right? In terms of the cost of the capital and how long it's been sitting out there. And so, it's okay for companies to elongate out there. For us as a business model, what it means for us is that, one, when we know something that's really promising is going to go longer, we need to be able to find our exits for that 3x earlier, so people get the good return of capital. But then 2, as that company continues to elongate the cycle until they get to exit, they need to continue to have positive ROI up ramp of each additional cycle and year that they spend building that business. And so for us, right after 10 years, we don't get fees anymore, right? There's no operating capital for us to do this. So now we're spending time to continue to mentor and work with that company, outside of anything that keeps our kids fed at the end of the day. But, we are still incentivized on the upside. And so we're very much interested on what's going to happen with the business, where they're going to go, and how we can be supportive to that growth cycle. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying it messes with our business model, but it works well sometimes, right? And we need to do that. We're not designed to be a 20-year fund, but we can, work with our LPs where it makes sense and say, look, we've already returned everything we've already told you we're going to do, right? We want to make sure we have the hits, that we're a good investor, and you're going to want to continue to put money into our fund, and we can continue to invest in more companies. But in addition, we've got another business that we think is going to be really interesting. We're going to put into a special trust, or we can remove, some of the equity to go back directly to you as the LPs. But we'll figure out a structure on our side of the house, make sure that you are made whole and able to continue to see the upside of what your early investment is proving to do. Now, if you're in year 10, right, and the company is really not doing something, it's not going to make any sense for us to try to manage it, right? There's some companies that we just call the living dead, right? So they're functional, maybe they return 1x. We'll figure out a way just to get the equity back to somebody else, right? And you're just, we'll forget about that or write it off of our side of the fund typically. So I know you had a few other questions within that question, but hopefully that answers at least the 10,000 level of what is a VC in the business to try to do here.
Yeah, there's a pretty lengthy. So thanks, Emil. So maybe we'll come back to that if we have time. And it's like the ABCs of creating your own VC fund. But I appreciate the glimpse into that. I want to say
Yeah,
here, but
and then
just your check size. How much money do you raise? And then how much is like per startup do you usually give out for a check?
Yeah, it's great. I will say before I jump into that, the other piece of like structurally, what is the VC and what does it take? Like, there are lawyers for that. They're really boring text on what it takes and how it organizes. It's legally semi-complex, but the function is pretty straightforward. So if anyone's interested in, actually starting a venture fund, I'm more than happy to jump a call separate, because that's a nuanced conversation that probably not everyone wants to hear. On the more exciting side, as Brad's question said, right, what is our check size? We are typically a first entry point of 500K. We're only 1 to 2 rounds. And so what we like to do is from fund 2, plan to deploy up to $1.5 million in each company that we invest over the lifetime of their business. But we will only do that in 1 to 2 rounds. And so typically a pre-seed check will be 500K. And as we get to scale on our own fund, a seed check will go typically $1 million to $1.5 million, so that we have a nice balance. And so we only do 2 rounds for a number of reasons. One, we're very big portfolio constructionists, so we believe that having a good mix of businesses and companies is essential to diversifying the risk profile that we talked about earlier, of like, how do we model our own return structure. And so 30 to 36 companies is kind of our sweet spot of where we want to be. And so we get too much concentration to a single company. That's not great. 2, and it's less so true now, but it was very true historically, signaling effect of prior VCs not following on, unless there's a policy, was seen as a really bad signal by next round of investors. And so we like to say that we don't actually follow on any of our deals. And so, our goal is to strategically build these companies so that they're in that next round, and then connect them to the right capital partners. And so we can never be seen as a negative indicator or sign for our companies about where they're going and whether or not they're going to get to the next stage. And so, from kind of a structural perspective, that's how we view it. From a fund size perspective, our first fund, our test fund, was a $10.5 million vehicle. Fund 2, we've got about $25 million hard closed and soft closed so far, against a $50 million fundraise. And so everything goes to plan, and we're all good. We'll have $50 million of deployable cash, hopefully by sometime in the middle of the summer this year.
All right. If you want to take a really small check, I'll give you one. But I think, I guess my personal question here.
Yeah, we'll have an SPV just of Startup Grind people. That's perfectly fine. We want as many Western New York people involved with us in every fund out here, because it's only good for the ecosystem.
So, and I'm gonna segue. Like, have you seen kind of like the time you've been back, like change in people for like high net worth individuals or organizations here in Upstate? Where I think you went into this a little bit earlier, but like have you seen a little bit of the tide turning in that sense of not necessarily the startups, but right, like the supporting community wanting to contribute or back a fund that's here? Have you seen that change while you've been here?
You know what? I'm going to say yes and no. And the reason I'm going to say yes and no is I think this next generation is really making the turn, right? And we're seeing a lot of wealth transfer from one generation to the next, and a lot of people who are saying, gosh, this is really interesting. Like, we should figure out how to get some exposure to venture and startups. And so we're seeing a pickup on that front. And I think we have a lot of people who are developing FOMO, right? There have been some deals that have had great exits. Again, if you look at ACV auctions, I think their final, C to IPO delta was 165x, right? So you put $100,000 into that company, you're retired at this point, right? And that's a really important thing for tech ecosystems. But you're also seeing those entrepreneurs. I don't know how many people ACV auctions, as an example, minted as new millionaires, but you've got a ton of employees now who have got free cash to come in and invest. So I think you're starting to get people who are educated starting to reinvest. I think some of the older Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, Ithaca are not investing in the way I was hoping, that it's not turning over as quickly. But the piece that I'm actually really heartened to see, and it's not the ideal solution, but it's an interesting solution, is as we started going out and fundraising, we've been going down to Dallas, Florida, North Carolina, Boston, New York. And the thesis of having a presence in Western New York and ties to the Rust Belt is huge. People are really excited about it. And so we're seeing more and more capital providers and entrepreneurs saying, Jesus, you can access these interesting deals in these markets and we can get to be a part of that. And you will help bridge conversations. That's really cool that everyone else's eyes are now looking at us. That's new, right? That's the last 3 to 4 years. And that's really cool. I mean, if you look at some of our LPs who are also mentors in Fund 2, we got the founders of DraftKings, the founders of Android, the founder of ButcherBox, I mean, you got, the guys from Paychecks and ACV Auctions and our local, entrepreneur network here and CloudChecker, who are investing in the fund. But we've got top leading brands out of major hubs saying, yeah, we want to see what you guys are seeing in these markets. And that's really, really cool. And they want to come here and spend time and actually, help and mentor, which is really cool.
Yeah, and this ties into I think Scott's question earlier around. I think he's in. I'm assuming NY is Northern New York, but he brought up the concept density, right? And asked kind of like, are you as a firm like helping provide anything, regionally, right? Platforms and assistances to kind of help build, like team build, right, locally. So. Let me see if I can find that, but I think I got the spirit of that question.
No,
you guys involved kind of building teams here? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the easy answer is yes, right? Like part of being here is making sure that we're present and available. And I always say any company that's within the Western New York region, we're happy to have conversations, and dialogue. The other piece that is interesting, right, is like we're talking about population density and what does that mean? And as I was saying, it's great to see everything reconverging around the cities because it makes it easier to do touch points and see a bunch of companies in the same time period and to add value. But if you look at where we are, right, like let's take Rochester as a microcosm. It's 1 hour for me to get to Buffalo. It's 1 hour for me to get to Syracuse. It's an hour, 15 for me to get to Ithaca. If I lived in the dead center of Boston, it'd take me an hour to get north, an hour to get south, an hour and 15 to get west within the same, investment area. And so Boston, I've got 4.5 million people within an hour of my house. Western New York, I've got 3.5 million people within an hour of my house. We're not that densely unpacked. It's just that you have to drive a little bit further to get there, even though the time period is exactly the same. And so, statistically, I actually think this metropolitan region, if we start to work more as a region, it's fascinating. There's so much opportunity there for us to continue to add value, to be creative, and to function like a mega city, just spread out through 4 different hubs and ecosystems. And that's not even including what's happening in Corning in the southern tier and out to the Albany and Capital region, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and I love to see, again, for some of the larger tech companies, just more people, that are working for them that are popping up at, co-working spaces and stuff in the city too. So like the more of those collisions we can have between the small and the big companies, even though they don't have an office here.
Hey, you know what? I mean, when I came back, right, the push to get Constellation or Wegmans or Paychecks to even look in the city was a real push. And, now Constellation's coming downtown. Rob pulled the trigger and said, let's make that happen. Wegmans has been eyeing it for a while. I don't know what their intention is and whether they'll pull the trigger, but that's fascinating. I'm not sure where Paycheck sits on the conversation, but that's it. I think all these guys, fundamentally are starting to have conversations, and it's reviving, and that's what's going to drive, Amazon and Apple to take offices here too, is because that population density matters to them in terms of putting together an office space for their engineering base.
Yeah, I'd love to see that just keep growing. But with that being said, was there anything that Impellent's doing? Because I know Denny DeLeo, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not sure if you're involved too, but the ventures jobs. So I've seen a lot of that activity from some of the work I've done around RIT and just following him. But I do believe you guys are also involved, outside of just the day-to-day fund, right, with trying to make some of those connections. Are there other tools?
Yeah, look, I mean, see. Yeah, so we're one stage in a very wide entrepreneurial ecosystem. And the Venture Jobs Foundation fills in some of that gap. There are other local, investment firms that fill in parts of those gaps. And so we're trying to figure out, anyone who comes to us, how can we plug you in to the right program for where you are within your cycle? I'll tell you, we're looking at doing acceleration programming. We're looking at hosting big gatherings. So we got something coming up later this summer where we'll be pulling in, the 50 leading entrepreneurs and VCs in Boston, New York City, and Western New York together to have a retreat and have a conversation within our region. So there's a lot of those other organizational and operational things that we're doing from an ecosystem perspective. But then I would say kind of your other questions, like what's the philanthropic or what's the community bend for it? Like that's very important to me. I grew up with a dad who's a doctor, mom was a social worker. And so my entire, vantage point has always been like, oh, I've been lucky to be in the position I'm in, and I'm really interested in how I can continue to extend my position to be able to connect more people into this ecosystem. And that plays from, just peer opportunity to making sure you get diversity in leadership roles and opportunities, and, to be able to take the networks that we've been lucky to develop and making sure that extends to, as many people as we possibly can. But what it also means is, I've spent time, when I was building the ecosystem in Boston, I was running a venture philanthropy side. Like I've sat as a nonprofit executive director looking at, how does tech influence the community and how do you provide equal access, and how can tech and technologists be a tool to help grow other parts of the community. And so for me, all of this stuff is highly intertwined. And so, outside of just the fun stuff, I try to spend as much time when, I can get away from my kids and hobbies to make sure I'm helping contribute to other parts of the community and continue playing there. And certainly if there's anyone else on this call who's got ideas or ways that they would like to see our community continue to grow that we can be directly helpful with, outside of the venture side, I'm 100% in for that and glad to help. So, I spend way too much time with like Awesome Foundation and RDCD or RCD, what is it, Rochester Downtown Development, RDDC, and economic development arms to try to help those things that, there's no way I'm giving up on what the rest of our community and what me making meaning out here could look like.
Yeah, we did a book club within the startup community for Startup Community Way, and that was one of the themes too. Is like every year, you're starting the first year of a 20-year plan. So yeah, I appreciate you being back in the community. Was there ever a moment like when you were coming back, you're like, oh, this is not going to work, or this is this is not what I expected, or like did you, when you were early getting on, like Impellent starting, did you ever have a moment like that?
Yeah, look, I still have these moments all the time, right? One of the things I think that helps us continue to be good is to always be, slightly uncontent about where we are and what's possible. Our area in Western New York, our biggest threshold or issue is that people still like their fiefdoms, right? People think that owning a certain corner of the community is how you add value, right? Or how you have value as an individual. And so collaboration from when I came back in 17 to today has gone way up. And it's, I would say early 17, it was really tough to get people to take you seriously. And we don't have, and I shouldn't say we don't have, but Rochester has not been as good at saying, let's pay it forward. Let's be a leader in doing something, not for myself, but because it's the right thing to do for the community. I think that mentality is starting to break and starting to change, and it's really interesting. And if you look at Buffalo right now, and I don't know how many people hear regular bounce between the different cities, but Buffalo has been crazy good at that, right? The number of people in powers of position saying, this is not about me, but this is about helping the next person. And I just want to make sure that I'm going to do a good favor today, and hopefully they'll do it for somebody else. And that's just going to create a virtuous economy. And that was the backbone of San Francisco. That was the backbone of the Boston redesign. That's new to us, right? And people are finally loosening or relinquishing some of their grips on what I would call the old vestiges of power But that's to me the existential threat for our area is, can we continue to look at how we work as a community versus how we work as individuals? Because if we can push into that community, we can get that collaboration, we can get that natural interaction that we was talking about earlier. There's so much opportunity here, so much capacity, so much intellectual and functional upside all across our community that we can really, really take advantage of. And that's going to take some institutional change, and it's going to take some mentality, and functional mind shifts. But it's right there, and it's starting to happen, and that is so cool.
Yeah, I think it feels like the pendulum is, swinging. I just shared personally, I was at South by Southwest in Austin this week. It's like, you can have a conversation with anyone, right? Like there's a founder, a VC, a musician, all like, at the beer, truck having a beer with each other. And nobody knew each other, like nobody, had an intro or anything like that. So I feel like that was a real refreshing experience. And I feel like, to your point, like seeing more and more of that happen here in like Rochester, I think that's when the rising tide, raises all ships. So
Absolutely.
I wanted to, there's one question in here, you guys feel through. I know we're getting close on time. But Emil, that has to do with the formation of the VC conversation, asked for like the VC, the size you guys are, small in the world of VCs. Is there anything you do to like manage your risk, like check-ins or, type of guidance you get to help, again, plan or manage your risk for your investments?
Yeah. I mean, to a degree, right? And one of the hardest things is both me and my founders are all former operators, and so we love being hands-on, right? And it's natural for us to spin to help solve problems. But once you're in the VC route, right, and you actually have 25 to 30 companies that you're managing individually, unfortunately, sometimes you got to watch the boat crash from the exterior, right? Like you can't be the guy pumping water from the bilge because, one, the entrepreneur needs to figure out how to do that. And two, you've got another fire going on at your house party across the street that you've got to go reconcile. So minimizing risk is helping choose the right people. Minimizing risk is trying to reduce the number of risks that any single company is taking on. That's why I was saying, like, if you're doing hardware and you're doing clean tech and you're doing, inventory processing with international development, your team needs to be 8x as good, because you've got all these external factors that could mess it up. And so what we try to do is, again, start with great teams, people who've been there, really tend to have a little bit of a leg up on this. People who put, other experience around us is good. We try to do as much diligence as we can that's practical, right, in anything. So making sure we understand the sector, the business model, right, the go-to-market team, the funding mechanisms, and the proposition. And then you also got to understand, though, even when you do all that work, the business is going to change tomorrow, and you have to be ready to do that. And so I think the number one thing, Emma, that we actually try to do to reduce our risk profile is make sure we've got a strong enough network of other people who can be problem solvers for the company and can help, support the entrepreneur's journey and growth. Because at the end of the day, we can do a little bit, Michael can do a little bit, you can do a little bit, but that entrepreneur is going to need a lot to be able to get there, even if they know what they're doing. And so the more we can build bridges and connections, the better off we can, do long term.
I appreciate that. Oh, we got a thumbs up from Emil. So good. Good. I'll pause just in case anyone had any questions, but David, we're hitting the hour. I like to close these when I do these with a question for the founder, as far as what's your favorite product of Rochester? And you use the word product loosely, that could be anything, person, place, time, thing, event. But if there's something that's inspiring or you love about Rochester, if you'd be willing to share.
Oh yeah, no. By far, right, the best product of Rochester is people, right? The creativity of a city, the function of its growth is based around the people. The reason we love being here is because we have great conversations and great dialogue. And that again doesn't mean that we're not without flaw, but we've got interesting places. There's reasons why Rochester, has reinvented itself 10 times over, 15 times over. It's why, some of the most influential, civic and social leaders of our generation, or not our generation, but of the country's history, have called Rochester home. I mean, it's the people. It's a city that we can make what we want as long as we come together and continue to do what we need to do. And I think we're pretty lucky to have the folks that we have here in the time and the place that we have now.
I agree with that. Thank you. As far as wrapping up, especially the folks that are interested in kind of the mechanics of a VC, is there a way people can connect with you or reach out to you to learn more, either about Impellent or just
Easily.
structured in general?
Easily. No, so our emails and all that stuff are on our website, but it's just david@impellent.vc. I'll toss it into the chat here so I can get involved on the online side of things. But feel free to reach out. Anything that we can be helpful with directly, happy to do that conversation, support networks, anything we can do, glad to have it. Folks who want to start their own venture fund, we're 100% supportive, and I'm happy to spend the time and help build bridges and build connections for you. Same with any entrepreneurs here. Happy to build connections and relationships anywhere we can.
Awesome. All right. Thanks. With that, I think we're going to close. I hope everyone has a great St. Patrick's Day. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone. And thanks, David, for joining us.
I still think I got half a beer here. I don't know if I can walk away yet. So no, thank you guys all for joining us. It was really nice to meet the crew, and happy St. Patty's Day to everyone.
All right. Thanks.